Good morning and welcome to another day of divine encounter. Before you check your messages, before you scroll through the noise of the world, heaven has been waiting to meet you right here in this moment, in this prayer. Today is not an ordinary Wednesday. Today is a set-apart day, a day of healing, a day of restoration, a day when heaven itself opens over your life. Somewhere reading this right now, there is a body that needs healing, a heart that needs mending, a situation that looks impossible, a diagnosis, a broken relationship, a dream that seems delayed. I want you to know that you were not created to live in defeat. You were fashioned by a God who specializes in the impossible, who turns mourning into dancing, sickness into testimony, and closed doors into open heavens. So wherever you are, in your car, in your kitchen, on your knees, get ready. Because we are not just going to say a prayer today. We are going to contend in prayer, to decree healing over our bodies, declare restoration over our lives, and call forth the open heaven blessings that have already been assigned to us. Take a deep breath, quiet your mind, and let's step into the presence of God together, because your miracle starts now. Healing is not a maybe. It is not a spiritual lottery where some are chosen and others are left to wonder if their turn will ever come. Healing is not dependent on the mood of heaven, on whether God happens to be paying attention to your particular file in the archives of human suffering. Healing is written into covenant, and covenant is not a suggestion. Covenant is a binding word, sealed in blood, sealed in promise, sealed in the very character of the one who cannot lie. When we begin to understand this, something shifts inside of us. We stop begging God the way a stranger begs a king for a favor he has no right to receive. And we start standing on what is rightfully ours as children of the covenant, contending for what has already been settled in eternity before we ever opened our mouths to ask for it. Think about what a covenant actually is. A covenant is not a wish. A covenant is not a hope floating in the air, untethered, waiting to see if it will land. A covenant is a contract written in the highest court, notarized by the integrity of God himself. And once it is signed, it does not require renegotiation every time trouble shows up. You do not read the terms of a covenant new every morning to see if they still apply. The terms stand. The healing that was purchased stands. The restoration that was promised stands. What changes is not the covenant. What changes is our posture toward it. Do we stand on it, or do we stand beside it, admiring it from a distance like a treasure we were told about but never taught to claim? There is a reason so many people pray for healing as though they are pleading a case rather than collecting on a promise. They have been taught, whether by tradition, by disappointment, by the slow erosion of unanswered prayers stacked one on top of another, that healing is uncertain, that it might happen, that it depends on enough faith, enough tears, enough fasting, enough favor. But covenant does not operate on the shifting sands of might. Covenant operates on the bedrock of already. It has already been decided. It has already been paid for. It has already been settled before the foundation of the world, before your body ever knew sickness, before your mind ever knew torment, before your family ever knew the particular ache of a wound that would not close. The healing was not manufactured the day you got sick. It was provision long before the sickness ever had a name. This is why the language of covenant matters so much. When we call healing a possibility, we are speaking the language of chance. We are speaking the language of maybe, of odds, of probability, as though God is flipping a coin over your body, over your mind, over your family. But when we call healing a covenant promise, we are speaking an entirely different language. We are speaking the language of certainty rooted in character. God does not break his word. He is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should change his mind. What he has said, he will do. What he has spoken, he will make good. This is not wishful thinking dressed up in religious language. This is the very foundation upon which everything else in a life of faith is built. If we cannot trust that healing is covenant and not chance, then we cannot trust anything else that has been promised either, because the same character that guarantees healing guarantees every other promise in the book. Consider how differently a person prays when they understand this. A person who believes healing is merely a possibility prays with a trembling hand, half expecting to be told no. They pray with qualifiers built into their words. If it be your will, if it's meant to be, if I have enough faith. And there is a place for surrender, a place for trusting God's wisdom over our own limited understanding of what is best. But there is a difference between surrendering to God's wisdom and surrendering to doubt disguised as humility. Too many people have confused the two. They think they are being humble when really they are being hopeless, dressing up their unbelief in spiritual language so it sounds acceptable in church. But a person who understands covenant prays differently. They pray with the confidence of someone reading their own name off a document that has already been signed. They are not asking God to consider healing them. They are reminding themselves out loud in faith of what has already been provided. This is why declaration matters so much in a life of faith. We do not simply request the promises of covenant. We declare them because declaration is the language of ownership. When you own something, you do not beg for it, you announce it. You do not approach your own house asking permission to walk through the door. You walk in like you belong there because you do. In the same way, when we understand that healing belongs to us by covenant, our prayers stop sounding like requests to a distant authority and start sounding like decrees from someone who has already been given the keys. This is not arrogance. This is not presumption. This is simply what it looks like to take God at his word instead of taking your circumstances as the final verdict. And circumstances will always try to have the final word. That is what circumstances do. A diagnosis speaks loudly. A test result speaks loudly. A body that will not cooperate, a mind that will not settle, a heart that will not mend. All of these things shout their verdicts with such confidence that it is easy to believe they are the ultimate authority. But covenant existed before the diagnosis. Covenant existed before the test result. Covenant existed before the body ever broke down, or the mind ever spiraled, or the heart ever cracked. This is important because it means the promise of healing is not a reaction to your sickness. It is not God scrambling to respond to a crisis he did not see coming. The promise of healing was already in place, already secured, already sealed, long before the crisis ever arrived, which means the crisis does not get to override the covenant. The covenant was there first, and covenant does not yield its authority to circumstance simply because circumstance is louder in the moment. This is the confidence that covenant produces, not a denial of what you are facing, not pretending the pain is not real or the diagnosis is not frightening, but a refusal to let the temporary have the final say over what was settled in eternity. There is a difference between denying your reality and refusing to let your reality be the last word. Faith does not ask you to pretend the storm is not raging. Faith asks you to remember who holds the covenant even while the storm is raging. This is not naivety. This is not spiritual bypassing. This is warfare, waged not with clenched fists, but with a settled heart that knows the outcome was decided long before the battle began. Think about how covenant worked in the pages of Scripture, how it was never a passive agreement, but an active bond that determined the trajectory of an entire people. When healing was promised, it was not offered as a possibility contingent on circumstances. It was declared as a certainty rooted in identity. By his stripes we are healed, not we might be healed, not we could potentially experience healing under the right conditions, but we are healed. Past tense, finished, completed. Not something still being negotiated, but something already accomplished, waiting only for us to walk in what has already been secured. This is the language of covenant, and it is entirely different from the language of hope-so religion that leaves people wondering, waiting, wavering. There is also something important about the permanence of covenant that deserves attention. Covenants, by their very design, are not meant to be temporary arrangements subject to the whims of changing seasons. A covenant is meant to outlast circumstance, to remain steady when everything else is shaking. This means that even when healing does not show up on our timeline, even when restoration seems to be taking longer than we expected, the covenant itself has not expired. Delay is not denial. A promise that has not yet manifested is not a promise that has been revoked. Covenant operates on God's timing, not ours. But the fact that it has not yet fully manifested does not mean it was never real. Too many people abandon their confidence in the promise the moment the promise takes longer than they anticipated, as though delay is proof that the covenant was fictional all along. But covenant does not expire because we grow impatient. It stands steady and unmoved, waiting for us to keep standing on it even when the manifestation tarries. This is where endurance becomes an act of faith rather than an act of desperation. When we understand healing as covenant, our endurance is not the frantic grasping of someone unsure whether their prayers are even being heard. Our endurance becomes the settled patience of someone who knows the outcome and is simply waiting for the timing to align. There is a peace available in this kind of waiting that is entirely unavailable to those who see healing as mere possibility. Possibility breeds anxiety because possibilities always carries the shadow of its opposite. If it is possible that I could be healed, it is also possible that I will not be. But covenant does not carry that shadow. Covenant carries only certainty, and certainty, even while waiting, produces a very different quality of peace than uncertainty ever could. It is also worth considering what it means that covenant is relational, not transactional in the cold sense of the word. This is not a business contract where healing is purchased with a certain quota of good behavior or a certain volume of prayers recited correctly. Covenant is rooted in relationship, in the character of a God who binds himself not to our performance but to his own unchanging nature. This matters immensely because it means our access to healing is not contingent on how well we have kept our end of some impossible bargain. It is contingent on who God is, not on how perfectly we have behaved. This should bring immense relief to anyone who has ever felt disqualified from healing because of past failures, because of doubt, because of moments when their faith wavered. Covenant does not hinge on our flawless performance. It hinges on God's flawless faithfulness, and that is a foundation sturdy enough to hold every fear, every failure, every fracture we bring to it. When this truth settles into the deepest places of our understanding, it changes the entire posture of our prayer life. We stop approaching God as beggars uncertain of the outcome and start approaching him as covenant partners, standing on what has already been promised. Every prayer for healing becomes less about convincing a reluctant deity and more about aligning our declarations with a decision that has already been made. This does not remove mystery from the process. There is still much we do not understand about timing, about the interplay between faith and circumstance, about why some healings come instantly and others unfold slowly over years. But mystery does not cancel covenant. We can hold mystery in one hand and certainty in the other, trusting that even what we do not understand is still governed by a promise that does not fail. Loss has a way of convincing us that it is permanent. It moves in quietly at first, and then it settles, and then it starts speaking as though it owns the house. It tells us that what was taken will never be returned, that what was broken will never be repaired, that the years the locusts ate are simply gone, filed away in some drawer marked irretrievable. This is the lie loss tells, and it tells it so convincingly that many people spend their entire lives believing it, arranging their expectations around it, building a theology of resignation around a season that was only ever meant to be temporary. But restoration exists precisely to answer this lie. Restoration is not a consolation prize offered to people who have given up on getting back what they lost. Restoration is the active, deliberate reversal of loss itself, not a patch over the wound, not a distraction from the ache, but a genuine turning back of what was taken, so thorough and so complete that in the end, the season of loss becomes nothing more than a chapter that makes the chapter of restoration even more remarkable. There is a difference between coping with loss and being restored from it. Coping is what happens when we make peace with absence. We learn to live around the empty chair. We learn to function despite the missing piece. We learn to build a life that accommodates the whole rather than filling it. Coping has its place. It is often the necessary first step, the survival mechanism that gets us through the initial shock of what has been taken. But coping was never meant to be the final destination. God does not call his people to merely cope with loss for the rest of their days. He calls them into restoration, into a reversal so complete that what was lost is not simply replaced, but often returned with increase, with interest, with a fullness that eclipses what was there before the loss ever occurred. This is the promise embedded in restoration, not a partial recovery, not a diminished version of what once was, but a complete turning of the tide. Think about what it means for something to be reversed rather than merely managed. When a season is reversed, it does not simply stop. It turns and moves in the opposite direction with the same force that once carried it forward. This is important because loss often feels like a current we cannot swim against. It feels relentless, as though it has its own momentum, its own gravitational pull, dragging everything further away from wholeness. But restoration does not ask us to fight the current forever. Restoration is the moment the current itself changes direction. What was pulling away begins pulling back. What was being subtracted begins being added. What was diminishing begins multiplying. This is not a subtle shift. This is a fundamental reversal of the entire trajectory of the season. And it is available to every single person who has ever stood in the wreckage of what loss left behind, wondering if anything could ever be made right again. Every season of loss, no matter how it manifests, follows a similar pattern. Something is taken. Time passes. The absence becomes familiar, even normalized, until it starts to feel like the permanent condition of life rather than a temporary chapter within it. This is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of prolonged loss, not the loss itself, but the way it recalibrates our expectations, teaching us to expect less, to hope for less, to settle into a smaller version of what our lives were meant to be. People who have lived in loss long enough often stop asking for restoration altogether. They begin to describe their diminished circumstances as simply how things are now, as though loss has the final authority to redefine reality permanently. But restoration refuses to accept the terms loss has dictated. Restoration insists that what was lost still has a claim on your future, that the story is not finished simply because a chapter has grown long and painful. Consider how many different forms loss can take and how restoration answers each one specifically rather than offering a generic one-size-fits-all recovery. There is the loss of health, where the body that once moved freely now moves with difficulty, where strength that used to be assumed now has to be fought for. Restoration does not simply offer management of symptoms. It offers the reversal of decline itself, a genuine return to vitality that does not settle for merely slowing the deterioration, but actually turns the body back toward wholeness. There is the loss of relationship, where connection that once felt unbreakable has fractured, where trust that once flowed easily has been dammed up by hurt and betrayal. Restoration does not simply offer a fragile truce between wounded parties. It offers the rebuilding of what was broken, sometimes with a depth and intimacy that exceeds what existed before the fracture ever occurred. There is the loss of years, seasons spent in confusion, in wrong decisions, in wandering far from purpose, years that feel entirely wasted, unrecoverable, gone. Restoration speaks directly into this kind of loss with a specific and audacious promise that even the years themselves can be restored, that time which felt forfeited can somehow still yield a harvest, that what seemed like waste can be repurposed into testimony. This is perhaps one of the most staggering aspects of restoration, its ability to reach backward into time itself and redeem what seemed irretrievably lost. Most of us think of loss in terms of what we cannot get back, the relationship that ended, the opportunity that passed, the years spent in a situation we would never have chosen if we had known better. We assume these things are simply gone, filed away permanently under things that will never be reclaimed. But restoration operates on a different principle entirely. It does not merely offer new blessings to replace old losses, though it certainly does that. It offers something even more remarkable, the redemption of the loss itself, so that even the wasted years become part of a story with meaning. Even the painful seasons become chapters that equip rather than merely wound. This does not mean the pain was good or that the loss was somehow secretly a blessing in disguise. It means that restoration has the power to take what was meant for destruction and weave it into something that serves a greater purpose, so that in the end, even the person who walked through the loss can look back and see that nothing was truly wasted after all. There is also something important to understand about the completeness restoration offers as opposed to partial recovery. Partial recovery leaves remnants of the loss visible, ongoing reminders of what was taken that never quite go away. Partial recovery says you will function again, but you will always carry the limp. Restoration says something entirely different. Restoration does not settle for a limp. It does not settle for merely surviving the aftermath. It pursues full reversal, a complete turning back of the season, so thorough that the very evidence of the loss becomes evidence instead of the restoration's power. This is a bold claim, and it should be, because restoration is meant to be bold. It is not a timid, Cautious promise that hedges its bets and prepares you for disappointment. It is an audacious declaration that no matter how long the season of loss has lasted, no matter how deep the wound, no matter how complete the devastation appeared to be, the reversal available is equally complete, equally thorough, equally capable of undoing what was done. This audacity matters because loss often trains us toward smallness. After enough disappointment, after enough seasons of watching things fall apart, we start to protect ourselves by lowering our expectations. We stop believing in complete reversal and start settling for partial improvement, telling ourselves that this is realistic, that this is mature, that this is simply how life works. But this kind of resignation, however understandable, is not the posture restoration invites us into. Restoration invites us to believe again in totality, in fullness, in the possibility that what was utterly lost can be utterly regained. This requires a kind of courage that loss tends to erode over time. The courage to hope again after hope has been disappointed before. The courage to expect fullness after having settled for scraps. The courage to believe that this time the reversal will be complete rather than partial. It is also worth considering the timing embedded within restoration, because restoration rarely operates on the same timeline as the loss it is reversing. Sometimes a season of loss stretches across years, and it is tempting to assume that restoration, if it comes at all, must take an equally long time to arrive. But restoration does not operate under this constraint. There is something about restoration that compresses time, that accomplishes in a moment what loss took years to inflict. This does not mean restoration is always instantaneous. Sometimes it unfolds gradually, layer by layer, season by season. But even in its gradual unfolding, restoration carries a momentum that loss never had, because loss is a subtraction that drains energy over time, while restoration is an addition that builds momentum as it goes. What took a decade to lose does not necessarily require a decade to restore, because the forces at work in restoration are not bound by the same slow, grinding mechanics that govern the season of loss. There is a particular kind of loss that deserves special attention here. The loss that comes not through circumstance beyond our control, but through our own choices, our own mistakes, our own seasons of wandering. Many people carry a quiet belief that restoration is available for losses that happen to them, but not for losses they caused themselves. They believe that illness can be reversed, that circumstances beyond their control can be turned around, but that the consequences of their own poor decisions are somehow permanent, a debt that must be paid in full without hope of remission. This belief, however common, misunderstands the nature of restoration entirely. Restoration does not discriminate between losses caused by circumstance and losses caused by choice. The very concept of restoring what was consumed carries within it an acknowledgement that the consuming happened through a process that includes seasons of poor judgment, wrong turns, and self-inflicted wounds. Restoration reaches into these seasons with the same power it reaches into seasons of external loss, because restoration is not a reward for having been a blameless victim. It is a promise available to anyone willing to turn back toward wholeness, regardless of how the season of loss began. This means that shame has no rightful place in the pursuit of restoration. So many people disqualify themselves from believing in restoration because they carry guilt over how their loss began. They believe that because they made the choices that led to the wasted years, they have forfeited any right to ask for those years to be restored. But this kind of self-disqualification misunderstands the generosity at the heart of restoration. Restoration is not a legal transaction that calculates fault before determining eligibility. It is an act of grace extended to anyone in a season of loss, regardless of the road that led them there. The person who lost everything through their own poor decisions has just as much access to restoration as the person who lost everything through no fault of their own, because restoration was never about deserving. It was always about believing, about turning, about receiving what has been made available, regardless of how the need for it arose. Understanding restoration in this way changes how we approach every season of loss we currently find ourselves in. Instead of cataloging what has been taken and resigning ourselves to its permanence, we begin to see the loss itself as temporary, as a chapter within a larger story rather than the conclusion of it. This does not mean denying the reality of what has been lost or rushing past the grief that loss naturally produces. Grief is real, and it deserves to be honored rather than bypassed. But grief and hope are not mutually exclusive. We can grieve what was taken while simultaneously believing that restoration is actively working to reverse it, that the same loss we are mourning today is already in the process of being turned around, even if we cannot yet see the evidence of that turning. This is the tensions restoration asks us to hold, full acknowledgement of the pain loss has caused, combined with full confidence that the pain is not the final word, that reversal is not only possible but already underway. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from knowing a blessing exists somewhere, but being unable to access it. It is not the same as having nothing. It is worse in some ways than having nothing, because it carries the added weight of proximity without possession. You know the blessing was spoken over you. You know the promise was made. You know somewhere in the depths of your spirit that what you are waiting for is not a fantasy, but a reality that has already been assigned to your life. And yet, month after month, sometimes year after year, the blessing does not arrive. This is the ache of delay, and it is one of the most disorienting experiences a person of faith can walk through, because delay does not announce itself as denial. It never says no. It simply says not yet, and not yet, repeated long enough, begins to sound indistinguishable from never. This is precisely where the concept of an open heaven becomes so significant. An open heaven is not a metaphor for optimism or a poetic way of describing a good mood. An open heaven describes an actual shift in spiritual access, a removal of obstruction between what has been decreed in the heavenly realm and what is permitted to manifest in the earthly one. Scripture describes heaven at times as brass, unresponsive, closed off, and at other times as open, releasing rain, releasing provision, releasing breakthrough that had been held back. The difference between a closed heaven and an open heaven is not a difference in what God has purposed to give. The blessing was never in question. The difference is one of access, of release,